Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and it is the afternoon of Friday, the 17th of March. You guessed it, it is St. Patrick's Day, so we want to send our best congratulations to all the Irish and to all of the friends of Ireland, the people who still speak some Celtic and some Gaelic, and we're going to have a little bit of that later on in the show, because we want to remind some people of some interesting facts about the struggle for Irish independence, and we want to focus on one of our, positive figures in recent European history, and that is Theobald Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tone and the Irish Rebellion of 1798, and the song associated with that event, which is The Wearing of the Green, especially as it appears in an 1864 Irish play by Dion Boucicault, who was a famous Irish playwright. And some of this stuff you can hear. Now, we've had a tumultuous week here in Washington, D.C., and the Trump administration has now managed to survive for 56 days. We're 56 days into the first 100 days at the time of our recording, to the best of my poor arithmetic. So it is a tempestuous and unstable time. It is an exercise that some people feel has been very destructive, and I'm afraid they're right. This week, I would say at the end of this week, the administration is reeling from a number of serious defeats. The first one, and maybe the most obvious, is the new ban, the ban number 2.0. That is to say, the ban on immigration and refugees from now 6, not 7, Islamic Muslim majority countries. This was struck down by a federal district judge in Hawaii the day before yesterday. And that, of course, has been compounded from the point of view of the administration of another federal district judge, this time right over here in Greenbelt, Maryland, who says that this is unconstitutional. We'll go through that in just a second. We've also got really twin defeats, I think. First of all, concerning the Ryan Care or Ryan Care Trump Care, there is some discussion about what to call this, right? It is Ryan Care, but of course it's Trump Care. Ryan Care has been there for a long time. The only way this is going to pass is by harnessing the demagoguery of the White House, so you can call it Trump Care, but this is in very, very bad shape. Some would say this legislation is already moribund, especially after the Congressional Budget Office and the defection of many Republican legislators, congresspeople, including Senator Susan Collins from Maine overnight. So Trump Care, Ryan Care, in big trouble. Same thing goes for the budget, right? We've just gotten the so-called skinny budget. In other words, an abbreviated, not complete. It doesn't have all the line items by any means, but it's a kind of a summary and a summary of changes. And that is also faring very, very poorly. Some would say that budget is also DOA, dead on arrival, on Capitol Hill. Right? That's what a lot of commentators and observers will tell you. So those, I guess that's already 4 defeats, right? We've got the ban, we've got the Ryan Care, Trump Care in big, big trouble, and we've got the budget, which is also not going so well. So that would make 3 important defeats. You've also got subsidiary problems. In other words, Russiagate will be back on Monday, because then we're going to have the first public hearing of the House Intelligence Committee. We are told that this will be attended by the FBI director, James Comey, a leading figure of the invisible government, a leading figure of the deep state, if we want to use this language. And of course, Comey of the deep state did everything he could to defeat the Democratic presidential candidate. So I'm watching with perplexity, maybe, or consternation, as various reactionaries, including reactionary libertarians and the whole gamut of all reactionaries, they're all whining that there's a deep state and somehow the deep state is being mean to them. My dear friends, you wouldn't even be here without the deep state. The deep state puts you where you are today. The deep state is what catapulted Hillary Clinton into obscurity and gave us the status quo, which we now enjoy. So that's the deep state. And this other stuff, right? The idea that Obama is the head of the deep state. Well, then it's not very deep, is it? If the elected president is also the head of the deep state, it's not the deep state. The deep state implies there's something a little bit more occult, right? Occult in the sense of hidden. All right. So the ban struck down, or at least not exactly struck down, temporarily restrained. And it's frozen for the moment. Obamacare replacement repeal with Trump care, frozen, bogged down, going nowhere, could collapse at any time. Budget, similar. Budget DOA, according to many. Russiagate comes back on Monday. There's also the question of, what can we call it? Emoluments gate, conflict of interest gate. That's always there. The hotels are operating, right? The innkeepers are presenting their bills and all the rest of this. And then the one that I think is also fascinating, in other words, not a specific issue and therefore harder to define, but in terms of the atmosphere, the zeitgeist, dare we say it, the Weltgeist, the defeat of the anti-foreigner politician Wilders, Geert Wilders of the Netherlands, who thought that his time had come. He thought he had the perfect storm. He'd had Brexit. He'd had the U.S. election with Trump. Wilders had been at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland. He thought he was going to become the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and he guessed wrong. And there is no populist wave across Europe. In other words, one of the key elements of the Bannon plan to subvert Western civilization, it's not going to happen. In other words, not at this rate anyway. There could be, some surprise. That's bad news for Le Pen, and it's also bad news for this rather obscure lady, Frauke Petry, who's the head of the Alternatives for Germany, right? And her task in Germany in September, looking more and more forlorn. So they're reeling. They are shell-shocked. And of course, they had to go through this question of the tax return, right? I think it's obvious to anybody, right? If you've ever dealt with human collectivities, if you tell people that they're not allowed to know something, they're not allowed to see it. If it's banned in Boston, they all want to see it. Banned in Boston is the best credential. If it's banned in Boston, then you want to see it. And if the tax returns are such a deep, dark state secret, why then everybody wants to see them. And it doesn't make any sense to get all huffy and indignant about the fact that people will try to procure these to see them. So we want to go through some more details on this, and we will do so in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, this was a week when you should have been subscribed to the American System, the American System.tv. The American System.tv is on the air every day, Monday through Thursday. Full hour of in-depth analysis. We were able to do what I'm not sure I can get to today. I'd like to. But the line by line, in effect, in other words, the top 20 changes in this budget, right, which is so shocking, and which is another tremendous step downwards. It's also a repudiation of the election promises made by the current administration. Right? They're not keeping their promises. Their promises are not getting kept. So we had that day by day. So this is showing you now that as we go into this time of intense political activity, we're going to have the French election starting up soon. We want to talk about that. We talked about the Netherlands. I would say that this program, between my two programs, this is the first place you heard that this supposed invincible march of the supermen, Wilders, Le Pen, and the alternatives for Germany, that this was not going to happen. You heard that here, using all kinds of means. So please, you should become a subscriber for The American System. You go to theamericansystem.tv, theamericansystem.tv. You pay the price of a couple of cappuccino frappuccino, 50 cents per program at the most economical rate, more if you can. There's a level where you're supporting our interventions here in the local area. This includes things like some actual organizing, right? Now that the political situation has gotten back into motion, you'll see we'll be reporting on these things as the days and weeks go by. So please, The American System, and then you'll know all sorts of stuff that we can only sort of indicate here in the 80 minutes, right? So the difference between having 60 minutes a day, Monday through Thursday, or having approximately 80 minutes under these circumstances. Of course, there are no ads on the other one. There's no advertising, so you can hear that all straight through. Now, the spectacle of chaos and disarray, and the problem now being that this simply does not play in the international arena, that it is not acceptable. You have people that cannot really be coerced, which is a problem, I think, for the current administration, because their ideas of friend and foe, I think, are tremendously distorted. Right? This is largely Bannon and company, right, and his intellectual or anti-intellectual tradition. But other governments, right? I mean, we'll say something about Merkel. I think a lot of this is not really so evident, but in the case of the British, it was. We had 2 weeks ago, after Sessions was forced to recuse himself from any and all probes about the Trump election campaign, which is so elementary, right? It's so set in stone, right, in marble, in the rules, the bylaws, regulations of the Department of Justice. Sessions had to recuse himself, but this then led to a temper tantrum and the famous Saturday morning tweet barrage accusing Obama of having tapped the phones at the residence there on Fifth Avenue. In the course of defending the indefensible, we have the unfortunate Sean Spicer, right? Maybe he's got the worst job. There's a little bit of a debate. What's the worst job in Washington? Is it the head of the National Security Council, where you get all kinds of political appointees imposed on you so that your authority evaporates? That's what General McMaster is reportedly now finding for himself. Or Spicer, right, who has to face the newspaper and press and media people. Media, by the way, is plural. When you say the media are. Medium. One medium, two media, and 3, 4, as many as there are. Media, plural. So you have to face the media pretty much every day. Or you can avoid it, and then you pay a price for that. So Spicer, in the course of the last couple of days, was confronted with the fact that by now the Democrat and Republican leaders of the House intelligence community, so that's Nunes, the chairman, and Republican, of course, and partisan Republican, right? Trump devotee, plus Schiff, Democrat of California, the ranking member. They say, and they're joined by Senator Burr, Republican of North Carolina, chairman, and Mark Warner of Virginia, ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. They all say no evidence that the phones were tapped, that there was surveillance, that they were bugged or listened to. No sign of that, according to these august committee chairs, right? Remember, the committee chairs, the bosses in each case, are Republicans, and we've got something similar coming from Clapper, right? Clapper on one of these Sunday shows the week before had said the same thing. So in the course of the contortions and the, we say, mental gymnastics or anti-mental gymnastics by poor Spicer, he happened to throw out that there was also, he read all the reports, right? Every straw in the wind, every piece of unverified, raw intelligence, right? Untested, unchecked. So Spicer is twisting in the wind, throwing out these different pieces of chaff. And eventually he gets down to the point of saying why Judge Andrew Napolitano, that distinguished jurist, speaking on Fox News, right, that reliable source, they said, or they suggested, that the GCHQ, the General Communications Headquarters of the British intelligence community, Cheltenham, right, Cheltenham, England, that they might have been the ones who wiretapped the Fifth Avenue residents. Well, the idea, in abstract, there is something to be said for this. In other words, you could say, for example, one of the books that I've written is that when the British, for their part, wanted to get rid of Harold Wilson as the prime minister, there were certain things that the anti-Wilson clique could not do. So they essentially turned to people like George H.W. Bush and asked him, couldn't the U.S. intelligence agencies please cause some trouble for Harold Wilson and later for Callahan so that Thatcher could come in? And I think that was realistic. But this, not. And we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, a diplomatic row broke out overnight between the United States and the United Kingdom. Take a look at the Daily Telegraph. U.S. makes formal apology to Britain after White House accuses GCHQ, right? This is like Fort Meade, Maryland, right? This is their communications snooping monitoring hub. And it actually looks like a hub when you see the picture of it from the air, concerning the wiretapping of Trump Tower, as we read here in the London Daily Telegraph. So there was a formal protest made by the British government. So Spicer came out and quoted Napolitano that GCHQ had been asked to conduct wiretapping against the president-elect, he says, during that phase, right, between November to January 20th. And the GCHQ immediately did something unusual. The GCHQ went public. In a break from normal practice, they issued a public statement, never done. Quote, recent allegations made by media commentator Judge Andrew Napolitano about GCHQ being asked to conduct wiretapping, in quotes, although the British have single quotes, not the double quotes we're used to in the tweeting world, against then President-elect on nonsense. They are utterly ridiculous and should be ignored. So that's what GCHQ said. But the real action, I think, was behind the scenes, and that was through the official channels. So, Sir Mark Lyall Grant, it's written Sir Mark Lyall, Lyall, nomen est omen, I don't know, est ne omen. Sir Mark Lyall Grant the Prime Minister's national security advisor asked for an apology, and this was given. So the apology came from Spicer. Sean Spicer said, "I apologize." And General McMaster said, we apologize. We apologize. So McMaster would be the opposite number for Sir Mark Lyle Grant. And these apologies were conveyed to London through Sir Kim Darroch, Darroch, who is the British ambassador here on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C. Spicer had said that Obama used the GCHQ, he would be able to get the information, and there's no American fingerprints on it, says Spicer. 3 intelligence sources have informed Fox News that President Obama went outside the chain of command. He didn't use the NSA. He didn't use the CIA. He didn't use the FBI. He didn't use the Department of Justice. He used GCHQ. Yeah, this is it's a stretch, right? As I say, things like this have happened, but you got to have something more than this. So the Parliament gets into the act. The leader of one of the opposition parties, the Liberal Democratic Party, Tim Farron, says that Spicer's comments are shameful. Trump is compromising the vital U.S.-UK security relationship to try to cover for his own embarrassment. This harms our and U.S. security. The White House confirmed that British Ambassador Kim Darroch and Sir Mark Lyle expressed their concerns to Spicer and McMaster. Mr. Spicer and General McMaster both explained that he was simply pointing to public records and not endorsing any specific story. Susan Rice, the predecessor in this role, right, which McMaster now has, Susan Rice says, the cost of falsely blaming our closest ally for something this consequential cannot be overstated. And from the podium, yet. So there it is. Now, there's also, the British demanded a promise that it would not be repeated, that they won't say this again. Now, I think this is interesting. This is sort of the geometry of this moment. In other words, the nature, the geometry of the space that we're now traversing in the political sphere is that the time of the throwaway line is rapidly ending. It may be completely over. Because here it used to be possible in the campaign, during the transition, during those first weeks, it's possible to say all kinds of stuff, and people might not take it so entirely seriously, but not anymore. Now this stuff is being taken quite seriously, and look, you've got the whole British Foreign Office, the British Parliament, all of them in an upheaval. There's now a real question, right? If Trump wants to go to Britain in the summer and meet the Queen, will that happen? Because the argument from these people was that it was an embarrassment to HM the Queen to have this meeting, right? So maybe they're going to have another go at it, right, and try to make sure that it doesn't happen. So all this stuff, plus this press conference, this was a painful experience because this was evasive action in the extreme. This was a verbal smokescreen. This was discrediting to Spicer for doing this, right? And you can see he's been given orders, right? Don't seethe an inch, hang tough, stonewall. Well, we are on this Watergate comparison now, whether we like it or not. It's unavoidable. There are other comparisons, of course, but Watergate is one that has a lot of relevance. And what the Nixon people found, Nixon and his two eyes, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and the rest of them, John Mitchell, and so on down the line, they all found that stonewalling doesn't work. You can't stonewall. You can't now keep saying, of course, the president still asserts what he wrote in those Saturday morning tweets, right? You've got to cut your losses, right? You got to give up these forlorn positions and push forward. I have to wonder how long Spicer can continue to serve after that acrimonious press conference. But these are, of course, decisions that these belong to the secret councils of the White House. So that's one. Now, on Monday, we're going to have this public meeting of the House Intelligence Community. So we have today, Friday, by the close of business, there's a deadline set by the House Intelligence Committee that they want the FBI, the CIA, and the intelligence communities to inform them at the House Intelligence Committee, was there a Flynn wiretap? If so, why? What's the FISA warrant? Was Flynn wiretapped? Yes or no? Was Flynn a target? Yes or no? So this is kind of big news whichever way it goes. And that deadline is today. And then on Monday, after taking a whole lot of flack about his role, right, about his meddling in the presidential election, no doubt about it, Comey is supposed to come forward on Monday and say, is there an active investigation, or has there been an investigation against the current tenant of the White House? Is that ongoing, yes or no? Comey. Comey, of course, concerned about his own reputation, wanting to serve out this 10-year term. Who knows what he'll do? But nothing but trouble on this front. And we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, reminding you to get a good dose of this same commentary every day, Monday through Thursday. You've got to go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and this is also a way to support my work, which I hope you find meritorious in some way or other. All right, so Russiagate rolls on. There's all kinds of stuff now about Flynn, that he was getting money from the Russian broadcasters. He was getting money from a Russian cargo airline. He was getting money from a Russian computer security firm. Flynn was earning money in all kinds of places, and nevertheless was allowed to carry out this function, which is in some ways the most sensitive in the entire U.S. government, because the NSC director has to have immediate access to anything, any secret, right? Anything he wants, and therefore that could turn out badly. So that's one, and that's the front that I think is going to open up. Now that ought to, as I'll try to argue here in a minute, that ought to alert us to the possibility of diversionary efforts, right? In other words, various kinds of posturing, histrionics, provocations, and things like that, designed to manipulate public attention and shift that away from this Russiagate front, which is likely to be the most dangerous. And it's also, the Russiagate front is not entirely separate from this question of, did Obama wiretap the Fifth Avenue resident? So, in terms of the immigration and refugee ban, I think we've said some of it. It is that the Hawaii judge built the granting of a temporary restraining order, the freezing order. It doesn't strike it down. It doesn't decide on the merits. It just says, while this procedure wends its way through the courts, it will be frozen. In other words, there's one way to do it is to let it go into effect and then litigate what should happen, should it be rolled back. This way is to say, no, it does not go into effect. We're going to litigate what's going to happen without this thing being in effect. Now, you'll remember, as I said, the Ninth Circuit from Seattle to the three-judge opinion, they built their case on the Fifth Amendment, on due process, that you didn't give due process to the green card holders, you didn't give due process to the people that had valid visas, you essentially invalidated what you've already given them. They didn't get a chance to make a showing in court. It violates due process. Fifth Amendment, okay? And we argued that before the election. We said, if you have a situation where people are going to be deported without a hearing or a trial, then that's the violation of due process. And I'm sure that one is going to be back, right? Because that could be used to argue against the entire dragnet, right? The entire anti-foreigner, anti-alien dragnet now ongoing. So that was the West Coast opinion. Now we have the East Coast opinion. The Hawaii opinion, right? The Far West Hawaii opinion is First Amendment. This amounts to the establishment of a religion, even though some of those due process questions have been avoided by lead time and paring it down and eliminating Iraq and eliminating the green card holders, leave them alone. Now you have in Hawaii, they say, look, this is the establishment of a religion. You're essentially saying Christianity is a preferred religion. Islam is to be thought of as a second-class religion, and so on down the line. So that was Hawaii. Then we had Maryland. And the Maryland judge, this was also extraordinary. He gave special importance to the intent. And the intent, right? This is funny because when you have these original intent characters, right? The people who say, I can tell you what George Washington was thinking when he signed this or something like that. They have to do historical research, right? They've got to reconstruct the climate of ideas. They go back and look at the debates, what was being argued by the foes and friends and foes of different legal provisions and clauses and all this stuff. Well, the Maryland judge essentially said, we can't pretend we were born yesterday. I think the way the Maryland judge put it was, we can't assume that the world starts from scratch every morning, that we start afresh or from zero. No, because what do you have? We have the election speeches and promises of the Republican candidate, which was a ban on Muslim entry into the country. We have Giuliani saying that he was brought in to formulate this thing. Here's what I want. Make it look legal. It's not legal. It's not constitutional anyway. And then Miller, of course, who said, yeah, we had to rewrite this, but the intent is the same. So from Trump to Giuliani to Miller, this establishes the intent. And again, these originalists, right? You're going to find reactionary originalists who spend a lot of time trying to say, but you don't understand. The original meaning of this was such and such, and I can deduce that from the remarks of some character in the Constitutional Convention. Well, if you're going to do that, right? If you're going to take political statements, well, then you're going to have to put up with this. I addressed this to this guy Toobin of the CNN legal commentator. I think his role in this is deplorable because he's up there saying, "Oh no, you can't include all that stuff. You've got to read the text. You've got to be a textualist in the narrow sense, not even original intent, but textualism. And then you've got to listen to what Sessions says and what Kelly says. No, you have to listen to that too, but you can't exclude this other stuff. All right. The president says that he really likes the ban. The number one ban is better than the number two ban. The number two ban is watered down. He'd like to go back to number one. He's obviously full of rancor because he's essentially saying, my handlers told me that if we rewrote this thing, it would go through with no problems. And now I've got another defeat, another failure, right? Failed on the ban twice. The failure, apparently the looming failure of Ryan Care, Trump Care, the looming failure of much of this budget, the immense danger posed by Russiagate, and then the failure of the international strategy. It's like, you can imagine, it's like the Communist International, except this time it's the, what can we say, the Populist International, the Nihilist International, I would say. With Bannon there, right? The worldwide ideologue of a rollback of the administrative state, the deconstruction of the administrative state. Except the plan is breaking down. It's not working. It's a little bit like the Bolsheviks, right? They thought there was going to be a revolution in Western Europe immediately. Didn't happen. So something similar going on with Wilders. So this is not exactly an orgy of victories. Very sinister in the background that we've got the debt crisis, the debt ceiling crisis is back on that fateful Ides of March. And the reason to be worried about the Ides of March was that the debt ceiling was coming back. And there's now a debt ceiling, and borrowing, to my understanding, treasury auctions have now ceased. There is no more borrowing, and all we got now is playing around with extraordinary emergency measures in the hope to get through a couple of months. So there's now a clock ticking outside of this entire panoply of policies that get on cable TV to this one, which seldom does. All right. Concerning, I guess we ought to say a few things about, well, the general method of the administration here. I think this is actually important. This is a concept which I have tried to develop in the last couple of days, and it's called scandal hopping. Let's look at scandal hopping. This administration now faces what we've just gone through. They face the Trump care, Ryan care front, which is going badly for them. They face the draconian budget cut front. They face the Russiagate front, the emoluments gate front, and other things. How do you manage all that? Their answer seems to be scandal hopping, and I'll explain that in just a minute when we come back. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all. We'll have something for the holiday here in just a minute. Time permitting, we got to move fast. So it's the 17th of March here in Washington, D.C., Now, we're developing this concept, scandal hopping. Look at this administration. What do they got? They've got a bunch of fronts, and they're losing on all the fronts. All the fronts are negative. There's no good news that I can see from any of these fronts. There's the ban, shot down once, shot down twice. There's the question of Ryan care, Trump care, bogged down, doing poorly. The budget. DOA under heavy fire. We have the issue of the emoluments with the conflicts of interest. You might even make conflicts of interest a separate one. We got Russiagate. That's another one with Flynn and all these other people, Sessions. We've got the accusations of Wiretap. That was a needless one that was simply opened up, well, as part of this scandal hopping. You got the tax return issue was here this week. So this started with the idea that the tax return for 2005 might have been the most presentable of all of them, and therefore this was done deliberately. Perfectly possible. I would take you back to the week ending on January 27th. There had been the Republican retreat in Philadelphia. There were lots of Republicans getting up and saying, oh my God, we're in hot water. We can't roll back Obamacare like this. We can't throw in Planned Parenthood. We're going to get our heads handed to us. This is politically bad for us. We're all going to be voted out. Our majority is in big danger. And what happened on the 27th? Well, then the first ban. So what you see, though, is a series of fronts. And the ones that have opened up in the last 2 weeks, we had the wiretap front. Obama wiretapped Fifth Avenue. That came 2 weeks ago, a little bit less. The budget one just opened up, and it's a very negative one, too. A lot of this is the work of these congressional Republicans. So what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You got 8, maybe 10 fronts, and they're all bad. There's no good news coming from any one of them. The only thing they can do, which is what I see them doing, is scandal hopping. In other words, they take an estimate. What's the most threatening one? What's the one that has the potential for the most serious damage? Let's make sure that that recedes momentarily into the background by turning the spotlight on some other one of these scandals. And I hear these media people saying, oh, you can like it, you can disagree or agree, but this man is virtuoso. He's a maestro of media manipulation. Yeah, in the short run, fine. You could say that we might have had 3 or 4 days, or whatever it was, 3 days of Russiagate if we hadn't had the 2005 tax return, if that's what really happened, which I don't know. But still, what's the cumulative effect? In other words, you're trying to get away from the most negative front and shift attention to a negative front, which is still negative. It's less negative, but it's still negative. So you've essentially got a zero-sum game where things are getting worse all the time. In other words, the entire constellation is one of negativity. You are losing on all fronts, and all you can do is try to juggle which front is most threatening, try to ameliorate that by taking attention away and putting it on something that's bad for you but not as bad. So ultimately, when we get into the medium run, and God help us, the longer run, this is no way to run a railroad. This cannot be a good thing. So I would say scandal hopping, when you have everything negative, it simply can't work. If there were some positive fronts, you could feel free to direct public attention towards the positive fronts, and then you'd actually get some traction. You'd actually be helping yourself. But right now, I don't see any positive fronts. So let's bear that in mind. So please, copyright Tarpley 2017, scandal hopping. And eventually it's going to be crisis hopping, right? If we have more than one, and we're headed in that direction. So we're just anticipating that. Here we finally have Tillerson. Everybody wanted Tillerson to say something. Now Tillerson has said, our patience has run out, and we're not going to have any more strategic patience with the DPRK, Pyongyang regime, North Korea. That's what Tillerson has now said. So that's very ominous. So he goes from saying nothing to saying something, I think, reckless and irresponsible. How about trying diplomacy? I would do 2 things. I would do the THAAD missile 1,000%. I would have had that there already, and they do have some of it there already. Get those THAADs into South Korea. Get the THAADs into Japan. How can anybody protest a purely defensive weapon? Yeah, first strike enabling. I'm sorry. This is a defensive weapon. If you're building offensive systems, don't complain if somebody's building defensive systems, right? This takes us back to a debate that started almost, 3 decades, 35 years ago and more, right? Under Reagan. But the idea is get the THAADs, right? Try to convince them that their aggression will be futile and that they're not going to be able to make the leap into anti-ballistic missile, THAAD, ABM kinds of things. So do that, but then negotiate. Say, what do you want? You want diplomatic recognition? This might be possible. You want a non-aggression pact? In principle, there's no reason why not, because we do not intend to attack you. And it's through détente that you can eventually dissolve such a regime, which otherwise, if you take the direct hostile approach, it hardens that regime. Think of East Germany. Think of the communist regime, the DDR, German Democratic Republic. The way that thing came down was through the Leipzig Fair and the many, many commercial missions, foreigners, businessmen, travelers, and so forth, who went through Leipzig and essentially made that into a very cosmopolitan city. The yearly Leipzig Trade Fair, Leipziger Messe. And that's how it came down. Didn't start in East Berlin, where everybody's on the government payroll. They wouldn't do it. But places like Leipzig, that's where it happened. So think of that. But if you had a positive front, you could say, well, we're negotiating with North Korea. Or, my recommendation, build some infrastructure. Now, that gets us to the question of this budget. Those of you who believed in the Republican ticket of 2016 and believed their promises, I'm afraid this is going to be a hard Lent for you. We are in Lent. If you haven't given something up, you better give it up. And I think what you better give up is believing in these promises. For example, Did you believe that Mexico would pay for the wall? Well, now we have it in the form of a budget that Mexico is not going to pay for the wall. Not now, anyway. We have in the budget, we have an initial appropriation of $5 billion or so, where the U.S. is going to pay for the wall. John Q. Public, Joe Sixpack will shell out for this wall. And not only that, but the Coast Guard will be cut, and the people in New York City are livid because the help going to the NYPD has been decimated. And the cover of the New York Daily News yesterday to today, go take a look. The New York Daily News says that this is crazy, that this is just, it's insanity to cut the money from the real front line in the anti-terrorism issue, and then let that somehow, use that to build a wall. It's just crazy. So, did you believe that? Did you believe there was going to be infrastructure? Well, in this budget, there's nothing about infrastructure in terms of the $1 trillion proposal or anything remotely like that. And we'll be back here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, the budget, as I said, the New York Daily News cover, front page of yesterday, they're up in arms that $5 billion is being spent on this wall, which has very little effect compared to what they consider to be the real security issues, which are urban America, New York City, first on the list. So they're trying to convey that it's crazy, right? And they show you a picture of the old World Trade Towers with the crosshairs on them, and that's now going to be in much greater danger. So Mexico will not pay for the wall. You will pay for the wall if this is what you wanted. And not only will you pay there, but again, you're going to pay with the Coast Guard in New York City and a bunch of other things. This is the hard power budget. No soft power, only hard power. Well, that's very, very short-sighted. It might sound good to a macho, but this is not going to be effective. Then you've got the cutting of the energy department. I'm afraid this is going to eat into things like the plasma physics research, right? The U.S. role in ITER. The U.S. will fall farther and farther behind in the international race for thermonuclear fusion power, which is going to be one of the decisive things to say who's going to be the great nations of the middle to later 21st centuries. Do you have thermonuclear fusion power, yes or no? We have the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. Is their budget going to be cut? It looks like it is, as part of the Energy Department cuts. As we pointed out yesterday, let me stress it again, the National Institutes for Health, with about, a $30 billion budget, they're going to get cut $6 billion, 20%. Now, this cut is draconian, it's drastic, brutal, it's suicidal, it's a killer. This cut is equal to the total current funding for breast cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and mental health. And I can think of people who are applauding this today, the dupes, the ones that are still dupes. Someday, when they're on their deathbed, they're going to think, oh my God, I'm dying of a disease that could have been cured. Maybe I shouldn't have been so enthusiastic about this budget cutting. Now, infrastructure. There is no new infrastructure in the budget, right? Forget this $1 trillion, whatever it is, 500 billion federal spending that would have been 50 billion a year, right? It's just not enough. We need $5 trillion right now, and the only place you can get that is from the Federal Reserve. And if you're going to do that, which you have to do, you better get it for 100 years, and you better get it at 0%. And with that, you would catapult yourself to the front rank. You want to make America great again, $5 trillion in 0%, 100-year Federal Reserve credit will do it. 30 million new productive jobs in the process. So there's no infrastructure in this budget. Even the Department of Transportation has some funding for Amtrak, for subways, and for light rail. And that is being savagely cut. Let me bring this home to roost right here in the Washington, D.C. area. We have something called the Purple Line. The Purple Line is what many major cities have. Take a look at Moscow. Moscow has a circle line that goes around the outside of their system, so that if you're out on the outside, you have to go all the way into the center of the city and then come all the way back again to go to a place which is really not that far away. Well, we have one like that, and it goes essentially from the Rockville, Bethesda area across. It's sort of the northern semicircle around Washington, D.C., and it goes over to the area of I-95, right, where the Amtrak station is over there, right? And the funding for that is now in danger. And this, of course, Maryland didn't vote the right way, I guess. So they're obviously going to have a very, very hard time. And this is exactly what a nationalist would not do. A nationalist would have national priorities, not narrow-minded, vindictive personal priorities. You hear that word vindictive coming up a lot. The Department of Housing and Urban Development provides Meals on Wheels for whom? Elderly people, poor, rural elderly people in old folks' homes, individual people at home, including shut-ins, right? The people who can't get out, they get a hot meal brought to them, sometimes the only hot meal of the day, the only meal of the day. Sometimes it's the only person they see all day long. So again, the infrastructure, no. Amtrak, no long-distance Amtrak. Maybe something for the Northeast Corridor, but aren't those the elitists? Hey, what are we doing here? And light rail, right? Light rail would be that purple line that I talked about. Now, here's the other thing. If you want to have, well, you might say, Mitch McConnell has said that the infrastructure is not coming this year, it's coming next year. Well, while the grass grows, the horse starves. This is a jobs program. You're supposed to create a whole bunch of new jobs. But assuming you did want to, which I don't think is true, for the sake of argument, we'll assume, suppose you want to launch your infrastructure next year. The Army Corps of Engineers is your indispensable think tank to do that. So you'd want to gin up the Army Corps of Engineers and say, guys, start drawing up the plans because we will turn to you in 2018. The Army Corps of Engineers is being cut by a draconian 16%. The NIH, we've said, how about this one? WIC, Women, Infants, Children. Government cheese, if you want. High-protein meals for expectant mothers, nursing mothers, for babies, things like this. Cut. No more federal money for Meals on Wheels. And then how about this one? Are you in New England? Are you in the upper Midwest? Are you up on the high plains? Then LIHEAP, Low Income Heating Assistance Program. Cut. Now, there is already a backlash, to be sure. What do we find here today? The headline of the Washington Post, GOP lawmakers hit White House budget blueprint. And hit it means they're criticizing it robustly. The defense hawks want still more for the military, but other right-wingers, other reactionaries are scared. They're running scared. They say some of these agency cuts are too extreme. Here we go. Some of President Trump's best friends in Congress sharply criticized his first budget Thursday, with defense hawks saying that the Pentagon spending hike was not enough, but rural conservatives and others attacked a plan to cut a wide range of federal agencies and programs. Subscribe to the American System, and you can hear what we had on that yesterday and the day before. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So that is this brutal, draconian, vindictive budget. Now, also notice, These are no longer throwaway lines, right? If you say, I want to wipe out this and that federal programs, right? If you say, I want to cut WIC and Meals on Wheels and LIHEAP and infrastructure and the NIH, that is an irrevocable step by you. You will be held responsible. You knew or should have known what that would lead to in terms of outcomes, including morbidity, mortality, and things of that nature. So you can't just say, oh, somebody gave me those figures, or no, I never said it. This time you did it. This is, I compare this actually to the Roman Pope, right? The Roman Pope says all sorts of things in the course of, daily work. But sometimes they speak ex cathedra, which is rare. This happens, not every year, not every 5 years even, but from time to time, the Roman Pope speaks ex cathedra. So we've now made the transition into the area where a budget proposal is speaking ex cathedra. It is a formal proposition ratified by your staff and then put out in written form, and not a tweet, but a document, right? It's available on paper. It will last. It will be in libraries for a long time to come. And now you're going to be held responsible for what you proposed. So now, of course, for reasons of economy of expression, I guess, I'm presenting these things as if they're going to happen. Now, I think a lot of them are not going to happen. I certainly hope not. That's the point of saying that there's this rebellion of the Republicans, in addition to what I hope will be a solid resistance by the Democrats, that these things will not come to pass, because there is no reason why they should come to pass. I wanted to mention especially the question of science and research, right? Because what do you have? You have your NASA program. Your NASA program, I think there are 3 or 4 space missions that are going to be cut. They're just going to be cut. And some of them are already going on. It's just amazing. You've got interplanetary space missions that have been going for a good long time. For example, the Trump budget kills 4 NASA Earth science missions. Now, the Earth science, oh my God, it's global warming. Yeah, but there's more to it than that. One of these is called Deep Space Climate Observatory. It's 1 million miles from Earth, between the Earth and the Sun. It monitors solar storms as well as climate change on our planet. Launched in 2015. That might show you that the actual climate change is caused by solar activity, which is what I personally believe. But you want to find that out, right? You can't. It's better to know than to just argue sort of a priori. This guy, Philip Larson, former Obama White House staffer, NASA, he says cutting the budget for science missions that are already in space, and they're just beginning to, the payoff phase, is baffling. The hard part, the costly part, is getting them up there. Why turn them off early? So here we have the Washington Post. They quote the Rush Holt of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, former New Jersey congressman. He says that essentially America's long-standing global preeminence in science and technology is now directly threatened. In other words, the real greatness, the greatness which gives you power and benefits all humanity in a cooperative way. That's what is being threatened. Instead, the dominant stuff presented by this Mulvaney, right, the guy who says we're cutting school lunches because they're not effective. Well, sure they're effective. They're stopping these kids from being hungry. You think hungry kids is the way to be effective? Then they can't learn? Then they become criminals? Or they have cognitive impairment? What the hell are we talking about here? The Heritage Foundation seems to be where Mulvaney gets most of this stuff. The Trump budget, according to the Washington Post, is strikingly similar to budget blueprints produced last year by the Heritage Foundation. The blueprints call for the termination of the Department of Energy Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA-E, which is energy efficiency and reduced emissions. Anyway, you can debate some of these points, but we're told China, North Korea, India are aggressively investing in research and development. The Trump budget could cripple the United States. The National Breast Cancer Coalition. And remember, something like 20% of women are going to have some brush with this terrible scourge. People's lives, writes the representative of the National Breast Cancer Coalition, people's lives depend on continuing this level of funding for research into biomedical funding and technology. So science and medicine leaders say spending plan would be dire, very bad for the U.S. And we went through a number of these previously. Right? There's just some of these things are so small. Another interesting article is, if you want people to come to the U.S. and be assimilated into a culture worthy of the name, you got to keep National Public Radio, got to keep public broadcasting, got to keep the National Endowment for the Arts, for the Humanities, right? Try to cut down on the crazy stuff, right? Cut down on the Mapplethorpe and that kind of business, but try to go for some classical culture. You could fund it through there. So all of that is now up in the air. Let's talk a little bit about the St. Patrick's Day, right? We should. St. Patrick's Day. The Irish Prime Minister, this guy was at the White House yesterday, and I thought this was extremely well done. Prime Minister Enda Kenny, the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister. So he was there because traditionally the Prime Minister of Ireland comes to the White House the day before Thanksgiving to stress the traditional Irish-American friendship, the tremendous importance of the Irish immigrants in the history of the United States, continuing good relations. Remember, in the 19th century, this was largely in an anti-British key. We shouldn't forget it. That was important at the time. And he gave a speech which was a veiled polemic against the current administration. And what he had to say was, basically that immigration deserves to be supported. He argued that St. Patrick was an immigrant, and that's for sure, he was. St. Patrick, this is one of the few things known, he came to Ireland from England. So he's an immigrant, and he brought Christianity with him. So here's an example of an immigrant who brings you something really good. So Kenny says to Trump, with Trump standing there, and he can't get away, it's fitting that we gather here each year to celebrate St. Patrick and his legacy. He, too, the saint, was an immigrant. And even though he is, of course, the patron saint of Ireland, for many people around the globe, he is also the symbol of, and indeed the patron saint of, immigrants. Kenny went on to say, in the past, we Irish were the wretched refuse of the teeming shore. Now, unfortunately, the raw story version gets wretched spelled wrong. There's a W at the beginning there, raw friends. But they believed in the shelter of America, in the compassion of America, in the opportunity of America. And Trump was visibly disturbed by this argument. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We've got to do three quick themes here. The first is this question of Ireland. Now, remember, I think if you were looking for national heroes for Ireland, one of the first people you're going to come across is Theobald Wolfe Tone, T-O-N-E. He is the key figure in the Irish Rebellion of 1798. Theobald Wolfe Tone, worked together with France, meaning the government of Napoleon Bonaparte, Boney, and they wanted to land an imposing French force in Ireland. If this had landed, that would have been it. The British would have been out because the French on land were far more formidable than the British, and they would have had a general uprising in Ireland. So we would have had this entire terrible 19th century would not have occurred with the British oppressing the Irish as much as they did. And I wanted to salute Wolfe Tone. We don't really have much time to go into this, but I've done programs about this in the past. Wolfe Tone is the key guy, 1798. It's just a matter of the winds weren't blowing the right way. They couldn't land at Bantry Bay, and that meant that they couldn't land, and they had to go back, and then eventually it was tried again, but it didn't work. So that's Wolfe Tone. Now, as part of the cultural heritage for that is this famous ballad, The Wearing of the Green. The Wearing of the Green. And I recommend that you go on to YouTube, and you should find yourself The Wearing of the Green, in quotes, as sung by John McCormack, the great Irish tenor, especially active during the 1930s and 1940s. And I just want to remind you that The Wearing of the Green started off as an Irish street ballad coming from the Irish Rebellion of 1798, the United Irishmen behind this, the Society of the United Irishmen. They chose green as a color. It meant the shamrock, among other things. And at a certain phase of this thing in 1798, people were hanged. They were executed and died as a result of the British demanding red, not green, because green was the color of the Irish Revolution. And for this, you can go check a play called Aranapogue. Aranapogue, or The Wicklow Wedding, is a play by Dion Boucicault. Boucicault, it's written. Boucicault is a fairly well-known Irish playwright. This is 1864. And in the course of this, he says that he's discussing with his friend Napper Tandy. That is to say, James Napper Tandy, who was one of the leaders also. He was an associate of Theobald Wolfe Tone in this thing. So the Wicklow Wedding, and that's where this thing got going. It got into the mainstream when that was produced. Boucicault fled to the United States, where he was active as a playwright. He wrote all kinds of things. So, salute to Ireland. Now, concerning the populist revolution, right? We're supposed to have the populist wave, implacable, unstoppable, invincible, sweeping across Europe. Sorry, boys, not going to happen. And the Wilders defeat is the first step. Now, Wilders is a pretty, shop-worn guy. He's been around there for, almost 20 years. He's been, at least in some parliament or other, in the Netherlands. So that is not a good result. Notice especially, though, the pro-austerity party, the Partij van de Arbeid, the Social Democrats, right, with this guy Gisselblum, they took it on the chin, right? They lost, 3/4 of their seats, 3/4 of their strength, and they had that coming. Because remember, Gisselblum is the guy who was so brutal with the Greeks 2 years ago, a little bit more now. So that party has been cut down to size. They'll still be in the coalition, but the coalition in the Netherlands will have to expand. Now, what I'm looking at is now the French, because this is a big ball game here. President of France, big important job. Now, in this, you have this Marine Le Pen, I think a substandard candidate in every way, but she is running more or less neck and neck now with Emmanuel Macron, Macron. And you're going to say, well, that guy's a Rothschild banker. Yeah, he was. Well, in France, they had Pompidou. Pompidou was a Rothschild banker. He was also de Gaulle's right-hand man, at least for a while. So I think they're going to survive it. I don't think France could survive Marine Le Pen. I think they can survive this Macron. So right now it's Le Pen in the first round. They have two rounds, right? We have Le Pen leading with 26.5%, but right behind her is Macron with 26%. So this basically statistically a tie. And those are the relevant contenders. Now, what happens in the second round? Second round coming several weeks after that. Well, the general pattern is it's about 60-40. It's a solid 20-point lead for Macron against Marine Le Pen, who has borrowed a tremendous amount of money from Russian banks. So is she a foreign puppet? Would she make France into a satellite in the way that certain Eastern European countries were? I don't know. I don't want to find out, though. Fillon is under heavy scandal attack. Well, Le Pen is also under heavy scandal attack, right? She had her bodyguard paid by the European Parliament, according to some versions. So, in the case of the two of them, it's that Fillon still beats her in the second round, but by less. It's more like 57-43, according to one. Well, now more recently, it's about 55-45. Call it that. So it's a 10-point lead instead of a 20-point lead. Because both of them are hit by scandals. See, the scandals cancel each other out, and that then leaves her way behind. Macron against Fillon in the second round looks like a win for Macron with 58% to 42%. So 15, 16 points. Now, I'm hoping that trend holds up because, again, I think this charming lady would be a very destructive, a very dire outcome for the French. And I appeal to them to think about some Gaelic, some good sense, and don't go for it. Now then, we want to also warn you. Next week we have the beginning of the Gorsuch hearings, and we are preparing to oppose Gorsuch. Right now here in Washington we have ads. For the first time we've had lots and lots of very bland, generic, banal, pro-Gorsuch ads. Now we got some anti-Gorsuch, right? The guy's anti-worker. 91% of the time, Gorsuch comes down against working people and in favor of large corporations. So it's the corporations beating the working people 91-9. He's going to be an activist judge, I'm afraid, in the sense of, Roberts. Oh, he was for stare decisis, except when I want to knock down more than 100 years of regulation of money in politics with the infamous Citizens United